Hi, my name is Marie Romagnano, founder of Healthcare Professionals for Divine Mercy. I'm so happy to present to you our educational conferences that integrate medicine, bioethics, and the spirituality of divine mercy in patient care for healthcare professionals. Because of their importance, even if you're not a medical professional, we invite you to join us. Today, I wish to summarize a conference presentation, Bioethics and the Life of the Spirit, given by Father Germain Kopaczynski, a Franciscan priest and former director of the National Catholic Bioethics Center, and an expert in both theology and bioethics. In his presentation, Father Germain points out that words do matter and words in bioethics are worth fighting for. He points out that the dignity of man comes from God, and it is the Spirit that gives life. The flesh is of no avail. The words I have spoken to you are spirit and life. Father noted that the prime directive on the old Star Trek television show was do not interfere in the development of another civilization. Likewise, the prime directive in medical ethics has been do no harm, and in the field of ethics, it is do good, avoid evil. We must choose our words carefully, and woe to those who call evil good and good evil. Isaiah 5:20. Yet in these troubled times, it seems things are upside down. We have no problem in saying a vegetable has no rights, but a profoundly disabled person does. Society would never approve killing an unborn infant, but have no problem aborting products of conception. We would be against killing one of two healthy babies in the womb, but have no problem in embryo selective reduction for the sake of family balancing. We can talk about a quality of life that is weighted to harm the weakest and the sickest. When deciding difficult decisions, we must fight for words. Technology seems to take precedence over morality. When in doubt, we must choose life. I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life, that you and your descendants may live. Deuteronomy 30, verse 19. I invite you to listen to Father Germain's full conference presentation as he discusses bioethics and the life of the Spirit. He is not only an erudite, but a very dynamic and entertaining speaker. I'm sure you will enjoy his presentation. Thank you.
There will be a final exam, of course, for getting your credits. If you can spell my last name correctly, you'll get a bachelor's. If you can get Father Mihalenko's, you get a master's. Then you get Father Kfawek and Montanaro together and you get a PhD. So Father Kaz is working on the mechanics of this, and without him I would be at a loss because my computer is always on strike. I was told that that's the greatest oxymoron in the English language. Microsoft works. And I think that is the case. So what's your favorite movie line of all time? I often ask that question, and many times people will raise their hands and say, make my day. Or there's one that I like from the movie Jaws. What's the first thing that Chief Brody does when he sees the shark for the first time? Turns around to the captain and he says, "You're going to need a bigger boat." If you go to the movie and you see that, it's a fantastic line. Okay, Father Kaz has got Dr. Jackson speaking now. Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn usually comes in. Not to Father Kaz, of course, but this is the greatest movie line that I know. And it comes from a movie, it's a Dirty Harry movie, Magnum Force. And how many of you have seen this particular movie, Magnum Force? I can't believe it. But anyway, what's the very last line of that movie? As Harry outwits the police chief who had gotten a group of vigilantes together from the police force, Harry turns to the camera and says, "Man's got to know his limitations." And that is my favorite line because I wanted to mention that to you. Unlike Dr. Thatcher, I'm not a MD, and there are some limitations that I will have as far as medical knowledge is concerned. And that's why it's so good for us to have Dr. Jackson, Dr. Thatcher, and Dr. Wells, and a host of other physicians that I can ask questions about regarding what's going on medically. My field of expertise is bioethics, and I will try to explain a little bit. We have two talks. We have one today, one tomorrow. Our presentation is called Battlefields in Bioethics, which we'll do today. And then tomorrow we'll do the ventilation, nutrition, and hydration. Today is the preparation. Tomorrow will be the actual rubber hitting the road of these particular issues, some of them that you'll be facing every day. Father Kaz can put this on the slideshow. We're getting there. Hey, there it is. Thank you, Father Kaz. By the way, for those of you who want the credits, you can sing my last name to the tune of the Mickey Mouse song. My brother had 6 kids, and that's how we taught each of the kids how to spell their last name. So just think of it in your head, and you can repeat it after, but it does indeed work. Who's the leader of the club that's made for you and me? KOPACCYNSKI. That's perfect. Okay. Marie, they all get a bachelor's degree. We are at war. I think you know that. And I'm not talking about only Iran or Iraq, Afghanistan, the Sudan, but Dr. Thatcher mentioned the fact that we have so much stress in our medical professional lives. And I think a lot of that comes from the sort of ambient that we live in. We are surrounded by bioethical issues, and they make us very stressful because our faith teaches one thing and bioethics talks about something else. St. Francis of Assisi was a very great hero of the church, and this is I always love this one. It says, when the dust settled, the bar was a wreck, bodies and broken chairs were everywhere, but no one ever again called St. Francis a sissy. They never. So St. Francis teaches, and by the way, I've been to some of these bars in Assisi. Now, some of you are asking, Father Germain, what is a nice guy like you doing in Assisi bars? And Father Germain, what's a nice guy like you watching Dirty Harry movies for? And of course, it's research. Research. You know I only do it for you. But St. Francis lights the way. St. Francis, when he had this stress about his last name, he cleaned up the bar. And St. Francis, this was the very first prayer he wrote, and I thought we'd begin our presentation with, let's recite together. Most high, glorious God, bring light to the darkness of my heart. Give me, Lord, a correct faith, certain hope, perfect charity, sense, and knowledge, so that I can carry out your holy and true command. Of all the great battles we fight in our lives, the greatest, of course, is the one we fight with ourselves. the fight to keep ourselves on the straight and narrow, and to learn God's Word. St. Francis teaches us about the theological virtues that we will need. And it's probably a good idea that Scripture serves us in good stead here, because we live in a world in which these words of Isaiah the prophet are very true. And he wrote this thousands of years ago. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, and change darkness into light and light into darkness. In some ways, that might well be a picture of our bioethical landscape. What used to be unspeakable now is regarded as a human right. And what used to be regarded as good, having a large family, is now regarded, for example, as you're polluting the planet with people. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil. Scripture wants us to know that the human being is a very special creation. Why? Because God took the time to touch each of us individually. Scripture puts it this way in the very first book. Oops. I'm sorry. Looks like Genesis said, the Lord God formed humanity, formed men and women out of the clay of the ground, blew into their nostrils the breath of life, so man became a living being. I want you to remember the prime directive, because that's what we're going to be focusing on in this Battlefields of Bioethics section of our paper. Now, what is the prime directive? Now, those of you who are in different disciplines, whether it's nursing or medicine, each discipline will have its own version of the prime directive. Now, what is the most famous instance of the prime directive that you know that comes from popular American culture? Yes. Now, I noticed that Dr. Thatcher had McCoy and one of the nurses. Dr. Thatcher, where are you? You had you had McCoy and the nurses there, so the Star Trek theme is there. But Star Trek actually invented the prime directive, and that used to be my very favorite television program of all time, at least until Tremors the series came along. But if you'd love Star Trek, who was the great hero of Star Trek? Now, this is what Captain Kirk really said. This was his prime directive, but he never said it quite the way. He said, do what you want, just don't blow us up. What was the prime directive on Star Trek? Yeah, don't interfere in the ongoing civilization of any culture, right? They had 69 episodes of the original Star Trek, and what did they do for each of the 69 episodes? They interfered in the development of local cultures. So the prime directive honored more in the breach than in the observance. If I were to ask you, give me 4 words that are the prime directive in all of ethics that Jews and Christians and Buddhists and Muslims and Zoroastrians and Hindus would agree to, what 4 words would you tell me? That's more for medicine. That's getting a little more specific. But for all human beings, I think this is what all would agree to. I didn't even pay them yet. Do good and avoid evil. I think all human beings, when they know what these words mean, St. Thomas is the one that said this in this pithy way, but there are others too. This is what we try to do in ethics, do good and avoid evil. But remember Isaiah the prophet said, woe to those who call evil good and good evil. And so we will have to be on our guard. What do we mean by good and what do we mean by evil? Now all of you, or just about all of you here, are healthcare professionals. What's the prime directive in medical ethics? Yeah, first of all, do no harm. I believe that is, most medical people would agree to that. I believe Hippocrates was the one that first said that, and it's been repeated over. First of all, do no harm. Now, if I were to give you the prime directive for bioethics, what would it be? I want you to fight for words. Dr. Jackson knows this. One of the things that we have to do when we're dealing with issues of ventilation, nutrition, hydration, and all the rest, fight for words and don't let the language be ceded to those who would take a different position. Now, who made this? What great philosopher gave us the prime directive in bioethics? It was actually me. I always said we should have this emblazoned over the Catholic Bioethics Center, that you fight for words. Bioethics is one of the new disciplines in medicine, and it's a sort of a new kid on the block. And we find that bioethics nowadays is a discipline that's fraught with some rather difficult conundrums it faces with us. And Father Richard John Newhouse, who's the editor of First Things, talks about it this way, and he's no fan of bioethics. Thousands of ethicists and bioethicists guide the unthinkable on his passage through the debatable. At one time, it was unthinkable that a mother could kill her child in the United States of America, but somebody decided, well, let's make it debatable, let's call it choice now, becomes justifiable with this reason until it's firmly established as the unexceptional. You can't be a Democratic candidate for president unless you back the abortion liberty. And it's gone from the unthinkable to the unexceptional. And who does this? The bioethicists, according to Father Newhouse. Oops, should press the right button here. The power of words, and remember, we have to fight for words because that's what we're going to be doing a large portion of our time. If I tell you we will do human cloning, immediately hackles are raised. So a bioethicist, clever fellow that he or she is, will decide we're not going to do human cloning, we're going to do somatic cell nuclear transfer. And what happens is that the people, the man in the street, if you will, who knows full well what this is sort of at a loss to understand what somatic cell nuclear transfer is, and suddenly the camel's nose gets in the tent, and the change of language makes this more likely to occur. Even the governor in California has gone along with this. He thinks that this is the greatest thing since Raisin Bran. There are some that would have you believe that Terry Schiavo, her life was not worth living because she was a vegetable. And they use that word, vegetable, and of course that's a pretty loaded word to apply to a human being. Okay? And yet they did, and they got away with it. At least some did. But what disability rights groups were saying, and what some in the church, many in the church, but not all, wanted to get out was the fact that Terry Schiavo was a profoundly disabled human being. And we'll see more about Terry tomorrow in her particular case. But the power of words to shape reality, if I use the word disability, I'm trying to get you on board that this is a life worth saving. If I use the word vegetable, I have given the game away, and I want you to make that life expendable. Euphemisms abound. In the beginning of life, you have all of these euphemisms, if you will. If you don't talk about an unborn child, if you call it products of conception, you have dehumanized in some way. If you have 3 fetuses developing and you decide to take away 2, and you don't call it killing 2, let's call it selective reduction. And the whole list goes on and on. End of life, which is what we'll be interested in, especially for tomorrow, this is a new one, relatively new, and we'll see where this comes from. It's a California state decision. Sometimes people weren't in the persistent vegetative state, but they were in what they called a minimally conscious state. And of course, it seems to me that the minimally is the operative word here. But once again, it's the creation of some very smart people to get you to think that this life is somehow not worth living. Let's not talk about euthanasia, but compassion in dying. Well, that's a good word, compassion. Let's use that, and on and on. And finally, physician-assisted suicide. Suicide, we know, is one thing, but if I can get a physician involved here, suddenly it sounds a little bit better. And so can you see the power of words to shape the discourse of what it is that we're doing in medicine? And you are at the front lines of this, as you know. What is bioethics? There are as many definitions as there are bioethicians, but I like this one because it was good enough and bad enough that you could pick it apart. A discipline combining biology and humanistic concerns in a science that would establish a system of medical, environmental priorities for global survival and acceptable levels of quality of life. Now, this was written by H. Tristram Engelhardt Jr. He used to be a Catholic, then he became an Orthodox, then he became an atheist. I don't know what he is. He's on a long journey, an odyssey, if you will. But what is it that's interesting about his definition of bioethics? Well, he mentions biology, he mentions science, he mentions medicine, he mentions survival, and all of those are good words, but be very careful. He also mentions humanistic concerns. Do you find that a little bit? What does he mean by humanistic concerns? He doesn't tell us, but the bioethicians will tell us later on. And this is the one that gets me. Survival is great, but now we're talking about global survival. Anytime I see the word planet or global in a sentence, I reach for my revolver because I know that there's an agenda here. But you know what's the real kicker? Acceptable levels of quality of life. Quality of life. And this is one of those Trojan horses that somehow sneaks in, and we find the good, the bad, and the ugly in this. Remember, there are many definitions, but I like this one because it does tell us he wants us to be scientific, but there's also enough gray area that the science is fudged by philosophy. Interestingly enough, even though bioethics has different solutions to different problems, everybody agrees on 3 features. It is interdisciplinary. We have nurses, doctors, lawyers, we have theologians, philosophers. We have all of those who are here. So it's interdisciplinary. All of us agree on the major issues, and all of us agree on the ever-expanding role of technology. The disagreement comes in with how do we handle these bioethical issues, but what they are, everybody sort of agrees with. These are the major bioethical issues. We began with these and we continue with these. How do we allocate scarce resources? How many of you are involved in that? We will be interested especially in the management of illness, terminal and chronic. Dr. Jackson will talk about some of this technologically assisted reproduction, decision-making for the dependent. So these are the issues, and everyone agrees that these are important. Now, technology is also at the heart of advances and in medicine, and everybody loves science, right? And so The technological imperative says the following: if we have the technology to do something, then it is imperative, it's morally right to use it. If we have the technology to keep a person alive on respirators, ventilators, with feeding machines and so forth, then we should use it. That's one way that the technological imperative could be used. That's actually an abuse, but the technology is there. We have the technology to clone human beings, or we have the technology to do away with human beings giving birth, and we can have birth in the labs. The technology is on the way. Is that a good thing? Does technological prowess dictate morality? Does technology trump morality? That's one of the major questions of bioethics today, and I would say that's one of the major reasons that we live in a world that's so stressful, because our faith might say one thing, and yet medicine, or at least bioethics, bioethicians are saying something else. Our Catholic bishops, in a document they put out that all of you should at least be aware of, it's the Ethical and Religious Directives for Catholic Healthcare Services, and you can get this online for free. I just happen to have a copy here. They happen to say this: don't assume that what is technically possible is always morally right. And that, of course, morality should govern technology, not the other way around. So that comes from the introduction to that particular document. How do we do bioethics? The battlefields of bioethics. I have been told, and you computer experts would know more than I about this, I've been told that the computer runs on a binary system. Everything to a computer is either a 1 or a 0. And that's how it does all its calculations. We see A, B, C's, and D's, but the computer sees it's either A or it's not A, and everything is a 1 and a 0, the binary system. In a sense, bioethics is very disposed to be looked at as a binary system, and I would urge you to consider Robert Frost as our guide to how to do bioethics. Poem that we all knew as children, at least most of us. Two roads diverged in the yellow wood. Sorry, I could not travel both, and be one traveler long I stood. Interestingly enough, this notion of two roads that we can take is very prominent in the church as well. The Catechism talks about the way of Christ leading to life, and a contrary way leading to destruction. So there's the way of Christ, which is the 1, and there's the way which is not Christ, which is the 0, the binary system. The gospel parable of the two ways remains present in the catechesis of the church, shows the importance of moral decisions for our salvation. You'll find this in paragraph 1696. Deuteronomy, which is one of those texts, talks about it this way. Moses got the Jewish people together, and before they would go into the promised land, he wouldn't. I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day. I have set before you life and death, blessing and the curse. The two ways, life and death, blessing and the curse. You are free, my Jewish people, to choose either life or death because God created you free. But as for me, I would ask you to choose life that you and your descendants may live. So that's one way of doing. We are free, we can choose life or death, and Deuteronomy says, I urge you, choose life, and notice that you and your descendants may live. But the author knows that you are free enough to choose. John Paul II put this biblical injunction into practice in just about his entire pontificate, and he talked about a culture of life. And this was a culture that was a civilization of love and truth, And whatever it did, it included the dependent in its way of creating a world. What do we do with the dependent in our reality? What do we do with the dependent in our nursing homes and in our hospitals? A civilization of life and love will make room for them because that's what a civilization of life does. But the Holy Father knew that there's also a culture of death that's afoot. And this is a civilization that prizes efficiency over everything else. And when Hitler talked about some people in Germany in 1933 and 34 being useless eaters, he wasn't talking about the Jews at this point, but he was talking about those that contribute to the state. And if you don't contribute, why should you live? And this notion of efficiency then became a hallmark to exclude the dependent from the care of your civilization. And that's how Hitler was able to do away with the retarded, the mentally deformed, the weak and the sick, the feeble. Then he worked on to the Jews, and then he got on to other groups. But he excluded the dependent from the care of the state. And that's where these two roads really lead. Will our ethics make room for the weak, the sick, the old, and the youngest? Or will it find ways of defining them out of existence by calling them blobs of protoplasm or a vegetable or one of those other euphemisms that we hear that are ways of trying to dismiss people? Two roads diverge. You and I we're relatively independent now. You see Father Germain walking with a limp, and that's not from a football injury. I wish it were. But we're relatively independent now. And yet we deal in a world that has a lot of dependent people, the youngest, the oldest, the weakest, and the sickest. How do we treat them? Do we regard these as somehow favored and these as somehow disfavored and make a ethical system that works accordingly? We know we shouldn't, but now it's not only religious people that have this notion that we should create a culture that embraces all of God's creatures and not just the healthy. I want to ask you this question. Who said the following? The moral test of government is how it treats those who are in the dawn of life, the children, those who are in the twilight of life, the aged, those who are in the shadows of life, the sick, the needy, and the handicapped. Was that Pius XII? Was that John Paul II? Was that Ronald Reagan? Who was that? Yeah, hey, Mother Teresa is always a good bet in a Catholic venue. But actually, it was the happy warrior, Hubert Horatio Humphrey, a Democrat politician back in the 60s, could say this and mean it with all. As you know, he was he ran for president and vice president, and he came very close to being elected. But Humphrey knows that it's not only a religious point of view that will make room for the dependent among us, it is a political, and the best of politics is involved in what Humphrey has to say here. We've gone a long way from that now. Harvard University is very much in the news these days. I used to go around the country and people would ask me where I came from, and I'd say I'm from the Boston area. And they'd say, Father, say this expression, park your car in the Harvard yard. And I would say it just like Teddy Kennedy, so the laughs and the guffaws would be. Harvard University, I just saw a young lady, a sophomore from Harvard, on the news this morning explaining how she didn't really plagiarize from another novelist. You saw her too, and she's a very gracious young lady, and the suspicion is there, but Harvard always makes news. The president of Harvard, Larry Summers, happened to give a talk about a year and a half ago to a group of pointy-headed intellectuals from Harvard, before you know it, he lost his job. He happened to say something about women and technology and science, and lo and behold, they're going to have a new president. So I'm putting my name in the ring here, because I could use the upgrade. But Harvard makes news. Around the turn of the last century, between the 19th and the 20th centuries, Harvard had a conundrum. They put up a new building, Emerson Hall, and it was the hall for the philosophy department. And the president of Harvard at the time was Charles Stearns Eliot, and he asked the philosophy department, what inscription would you want for Emerson Hall? Now, they being good philosophers, they all got together, and I think William James was among that group, and they said, we want on Emerson Hall the famous statement of the sophist philosopher, the father of relativism, that man is the measure of all things. That's what we want, President Eliot. They went home for their summer vacation, and when they came back, in those days, Harvard presidents weren't spineless cowards, and they actually went against their faculty much more so than they do today. And if you go to Emerson Hall to this day, you don't find this, man is the measure of all things, but you find this. What is man that thou art mindful of him? Now the difference between the one and the other, man is the measure of all things, is a human-based ethics, if you will, where man is the only interlocutor, and there's only, it's a monologue, only man. But in this one you have a dialogue. What is man that thou art mindful of him? God and man in a dialogue. And this actually comes from the 8th Psalm. And how ironic it is that the 8th Psalm graces the Harvard University philosophy building to this day. They've never decided, they never wanted to sandblast it away. And I always had a little thing about Harvard that you'd want to know. And basically that's what we can do with our bioethics. We can make it a monologue where there's only humanity, only human beings speaking, or bioethics can be a dialogue between God and man in which how we act is very dependent upon how God created us and how the 10 Commandments impinge upon our lives. Those are the two roads, if you will, that are diverging in this yellow wood. A lot of bioethics wants us to go the humanity route exclusively. We will make all the rules. We are smart enough to do that. The church, Catholic thinkers who think along with the church, realize that perhaps this is a temptation that we should avoid, to try to go it alone and to use a dialogue between God and man. And when God says you shall not kill, that has a certain repercussion in how we do medicine. So we don't redefine killing, but we redefine how we do our medicine. That's the two roads that we're facing. So how did they sell abortion to the American public? In 1970, a famous California medicine editorial put it this way, and the author was a pro-abortion physician, and he said, very considerable semantic gymnastics were required to rationalize abortion as anything but taking a human life. And they would be ludicrous. People would laugh us out of court if they realized that they were not often put forth under socially impeccable auspices. Hey, I finally figured out how to get, I don't know how that unwanted, but That's how abortion became sold. It was, forget about the divine law, focus on the human law, and before you know it, you will have judges, lawyers, and healthcare professionals all backing that abortion license. California Medicine, 1970. How do we do bioethics? And this is what we're going to be doing for tomorrow when we're talking about some of those actual issues. I want us to learn something from the feminists. They always told themselves that they should employ a hermeneutic of suspicion. When you hear something from a bioethicist, be very suspicious. Don't let that go without examining it for yourself. And I think that's very, very important. Secondly, for all of us in this room today, most of us are Catholic, but perhaps not all. And I think it's something that we should keep in mind as step 2 of how to do bioethics. A truth of faith and a truth of science can never contradict. If something is really scientific, it will not clash with faith. And if something is really faith-filled, there's nothing in science that can go against it. I said Harvard is much in the news these days. Evolution is also much in the news. They found a fish in some sort of sedimentary layer up in Canada a little while ago, and it has an unpronounceable name of the Tiktaalik fish, and everybody said, oh, this proves that evolution has taken place. This is the missing link, and the world is so focused on trying to make faith incompatible with science, and yet it really doesn't, and you can find all the fossils that you want, but Tiktaalik and the Gospel of Judas are not going to change the faith. They've been in existence for a long time. They're not a Gnostic gospel or an evolutionary hangover, if you will, doesn't clash with the faith. And we know that you should not kill. I mean, that's very good medicine. It's also very good ethics, and it's very good religion. The three go together as one. Once you start making exceptions and saying it's okay to kill this, it's okay to kill these, you come up with a world that is practically unlivable. If the Catholic Church were a computer, what would be its default position? Now, all of us know that you bring home a computer from the store, and if it's anything except a Microsoft product, you plug it and you play it, right? Plug and play. With Microsoft, it's always plug and pray. But the computer comes from the factory with default settings. And these default settings are built in. Now, can you change the defaults? Usually you can. But how do you do it? You have to read a manual that's about 6 inches tall, and it's the toughest thing to read since the MIT handbook. So nobody wants to change the default settings. And basically, if the church were a computer, what would be its default setting? Father Germain, once again, comes to the rescue, and I have a 3-word default setting that I want us to keep in mind. The church's default position, it is that there is a bias for bios in Catholic healthcare. When in doubt, choose life. This bias for bios, don't be afraid of the word bias, if you will. It just means that we're human beings, we have predilections, and this is a built-in guide, if you will. The built-in guide in Catholic teaching is for life, not for death, but for life. So when in doubt, this is what we really want to choose. And I'd like to end with 2 slides here, and I'm gone over a few minutes, but Dr. Thatcher went over a few minutes too, so there. No, he had a good presentation, though. That was. But anyway, If you're in Catholic healthcare, this is what you must do. You must defend human dignity, you care for the poor, you contribute to society's common good, you exercise, hey, thank you. I don't know how I'm doing it, believe me. That Gates. Exercise responsible stewardship, and refuse to provide medical procedures that are judged morally wrong by the teaching authority of the church. Now, what are these medical procedures? Basically, this is in this document of Catholic healthcare, you'll find that these are not regarded by the church as legitimate procedures, that they're actually in violation of human dignity. I'll just list them here, but it's a good thing to keep them in mind. All of these violate human dignity, and all of these take us down the wrong road, take us down one of those roads that leads to death. Now you see, so far these are all for the beginning of life, and yet this very last one, euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, I would have to close all the Catholic hospitals in the country if they wanted me to perform physician-assisted suicide. It says you have to do this under pain of getting not receiving any government money. And so the church has some very definite ways of how it abides by this particular civilization of love, and it will not follow a culture of death. So we'll see this especially tomorrow. Preview of coming attractions. Ordinary means, okay, we'll see these also tomorrow, but we find this in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Extraordinary means, and I would like to end with a man with whom we've walked some distance today, our good friend Robert Frost. When we're walking down these two roads, when we come to the fork in the road, remember what Yogi Berra said, when you come to the fork in the road, take it. Now that's Yogi, and a lot of us think that we're like Yogi, but we can't do that. Robert Frost, he knew he had to travel down one, and he chose the one less traveled, which is what we're trying to do here today. But Robert Frost also, what's on Robert Frost's epitaph? What's on his tombstone? I went once to Bennington and I rubbed it, and this is actually what you'll find if you go to Bennington. Let's go here. I had a lover's quarrel with the world. In a sense, all of us in this room are here because we do have a lover's quarrel with the world. We love our world. We love the medical people in it who don't always share the faith. And sometimes we quarrel with them because we think that our way is a way of life and theirs is not. And we have to engage in dialogue. But this lover's quarrel with the world is something very important for us. We're fighters, we're scrappers, we're battlers, and we have to fight for the work of God in this wonderful world that we live in. And so don't be afraid of the battle, and we hope that we'll give you some ammunition during these 2 days, that your guns and your quivers will be loaded with arrows and bullets. Thank you very much.